Preston's laughter echoed through the courtroom. He leaned toward his expensive lawyer, voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "She can't even afford an attorney. This will be over in 10 minutes. Across the aisle, Brooke sat alone, trembling hands, empty chair beside her. The judge shuffled papers, ready to proceed with what everyone assumed would be a one-sided slaughter. But then the heavy oak doors swung open. An older man stepped in. Silver hair, calloused hands, a faded suit that hadn't seen a courtroom in 25 years. Preston smirked at his father-in-law. The gardener came to watch? He had no idea that those weathered hands once held case files, not shovels. And what happened next would make Preston regret every word he ever said. The fluorescent lights of Courtroom 7 hummed with cold indifference. Outside, the October morning had painted the sky in shades of gray, and that same grayness seemed to seep through the tall windows, settling into every corner of the room like an unwelcome guest. Brooke Jennings sat at the respondent's table, her fingers interlocked so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She was 32 years old, but today she felt ancient. The weight of sleepless nights pressed against her eyelids, and the hollow ache in her chest had become so familiar that she almost forgot what it felt like to breathe without it. Across the aisle, Preston Whitmore adjusted his silk tie with the casual confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. His charcoal suit probably cost more than Brooke's monthly rent, and the gold cufflinks catching the light were a gift from his father, a man who measured love in dollars and success in zeros. Preston's attorney, Charles Merrick, sat beside him, a legal shark from Davidson and Associates, the most prestigious firm in the county. Merrick's billable hours alone could fund a small college scholarship. They whispered to each other, and Preston's laughter cut through the silence like broken glass. Brooke kept her eyes forward. She had learned long ago that looking at Preston when he was enjoying himself only made things worse. 7 years of marriage had taught her to read the weather of his moods, to know when to speak and when to disappear. She had become an expert at becoming invisible, but invisibility had not protected her. It had only made it easier for him to erase her entirely. 3 months ago, when she finally gathered the courage to ask for a divorce, Preston had responded by freezing their joint accounts, canceling her credit cards, and hiring the most expensive legal team money could buy. The empty chair beside her felt like an accusation. Every other case today had 2 chairs filled. Lawyers in pressed suits, legal assistants with organized folders, clients who could afford representation. But Brooke had nothing. She had spent the last of her savings on the filing fees, and the 3 attorneys she had consulted all wanted retainers she could never pay. So here she was, representing herself against a man who viewed the legal system as just another game he could win with enough money. She had stayed up until 3 in the morning reading legal procedures online, highlighting passages in library books, trying to learn in weeks what lawyers studied for years. It felt like bringing a paper shield to a gunfight. In the gallery behind her, a handful of observers waited for the morning session to begin. None of them were there for her. She had not told anyone about today, not even her father. Especially not her father. Harold Jennings was 70 years old, living 4 hours away in the small town where Brooke had grown up. He had his own struggles, his own quiet life. She could not bear to drag him into this mess, to let him see how badly she had failed at the one thing she thought she had done right. She had married Preston believing she was building a future. Instead, she had only constructed a prettier cage. The reason she fought sat in a photograph tucked inside her purse. Penny, 7 years old, with her grandfather's stubborn chin and her mother's hopeful eyes. That little girl was the only beautiful thing to come from her marriage, and Preston knew it. He did not want custody because he loved Penny. In their entire marriage, Brooke could count on one hand the number of times he had read their daughter a bedtime story. No, Preston wanted custody because it was the most effective way to hurt her. He had said as much during their last argument, his voice cold and precise. "You want to leave? Fine. But I'll make sure you lose everything that matters." Judge Patricia Coleman entered through the side door, and everyone rose. She was a woman in her early 60s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and reading glasses perched on her nose. Her reputation preceded her: fair, thorough, and utterly immune to theatrics. Brooke had taken this as a small hope. Surely a fair judge would see through Preston's manipulation. But fairness required both sides to have equal footing, and Brooke was standing on quicksand. The judge settled into her chair and surveyed the room over her glasses. Her gaze lingered on the empty chair beside Brooke, and something flickered across her face. Concern, perhaps, or pity. Brooke was not sure which was worse. Judge Coleman shuffled through her papers and cleared her throat. "We are here today for the matter of Whitmore versus Whitmore, case number 24738. This is a preliminary hearing regarding the dissolution of marriage and custody arrangements for the minor child." She looked up. "Mr. Merrick, I see you are representing the petitioner. And Mrs. Whitmore, you are appearing pro se, representing yourself. Is that correct?" Brooke's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Yes, Your Honor." Preston leaned over to whisper something to Merrick, and both men chuckled softly. The sound crawled under Brooke's skin. Merrick rose with the practiced ease of a man who had performed this dance 1,000 times. His voice was smooth, reasonable, the kind of voice that made unreasonable things sound perfectly logical. "Your Honor, my client is seeking primary custody of the minor child, Penelope Whitmore, age 7. We will be presenting evidence that the respondent lacks the financial stability and emotional capacity to provide adequate care for the child." Brooke's heart hammered against her ribs. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for it. But hearing the words spoken aloud, in this cold room, under these harsh lights, made them feel more real, more dangerous. She stood, clutching her notes with trembling hands. "Your Honor, I would like to respond. I have been the primary caregiver for our daughter since she was born. My husband's claims about my financial situation are misleading, because he is the one who cut off my access to our joint accounts after I filed for divorce." Merrick's smile never wavered. "Your Honor, regardless of the circumstances, the fact remains that Mrs. Whitmore currently has no stable income and no legal representation. We believe this speaks to her overall ability to make sound decisions for her child's future. A mother who cannot even hire an attorney should not be entrusted with raising a child." The words landed like physical blows. Brooke opened her mouth to object, but the legal terminology she had studied suddenly felt like a foreign language. What was the proper way to respond? What were the magic words that would make them listen? Preston watched her struggle with a small, satisfied smile. He looked like a cat watching a wounded bird. Judge Coleman held up her hand. "Mr. Merrick, this court does not penalize individuals for exercising their right to self-representation. Let's keep our arguments focused on relevant evidence." But the damage was done. Brooke could see it in the way the court reporter glanced at her, the way the bailiff shifted his weight. They all saw what Preston saw: a woman out of her depth, drowning in a system she did not understand. And maybe they were right. Maybe she was foolish to think she could fight this battle alone. The morning session crawled forward. Merrick presented financial documents showing Preston's substantial income, his stable employment, his 3-bedroom house in a good school district. He painted a picture of a responsible father who simply wanted what was best for his child. When it was Brooke's turn to respond, she fumbled through her arguments, mispronouncing legal terms, struggling to find the right documents in her disorganized folder. Every mistake felt like another nail in her coffin. During a brief recess, Brooke escaped to the hallway. She found a bench near the water fountain and collapsed onto it, her composure finally cracking. Tears slid down her cheeks, hot and shameful. She had promised herself she would not cry. Crying was weakness, and weakness was something Preston always exploited. But she was so tired, so impossibly tired of fighting battles she could not win. She thought about Penny, staying with a neighbor back home, probably coloring pictures at the kitchen table, unaware that her entire future was being decided in this sterile building. Penny, who still believed that grown-ups knew what they were doing. Penny, who had asked last night why Daddy and Mommy lived in different houses now, and whether she had done something wrong. Brooke had held her daughter close and promised that everything would be okay. But promises felt hollow when you had no power to keep them. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her look. The message was from Martha Chen, her elderly neighbor from back home. "Honey, I'm sorry. I had to tell your father. He needed to know." Brooke's stomach dropped. She had specifically asked Martha not to say anything. Her father had enough on his plate. He did not need to worry about her mess. She started typing a response, but before she could finish, the bailiff appeared in the hallway. "Mrs. Whitmore, court is resuming." She wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and walked back into the courtroom. The afternoon session would be worse than the morning. Merrick would call witnesses, present more evidence, build his case brick by brick until there was nothing left of her credibility. And she would stand there, alone, watching her world collapse. What Brooke did not know was that 4 hours away, an old pickup truck was already on the highway, pushing past the speed limit for the first time in decades. Behind the wheel, Harold Jennings gripped the steering wheel with hands that had spent the last 25 years in soil and sun. But those hands remembered other things too. They remembered the weight of legal briefs, the feel of a courtroom podium, the particular satisfaction of dismantling a weak argument. Some skills, once learned, never truly fade. They only wait for the moment when they are needed again. 25 years earlier, Harold Jennings had been a different man. At 45, he was one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in Millbrook County. His office downtown was small but always busy, filled with clients who could not afford the big firms but deserved justice just the same. He took cases that other lawyers rejected: tenant rights, workplace discrimination, small claims that would never make headlines but meant everything to the people involved. The courthouse knew him well. Judges respected his preparation, opponents feared his cross-examinations, and his closing arguments had moved more than one jury to tears. But Harold's greatest pride was not his legal career. It was his family. His wife, Catherine, had been a court clerk when they first met, a woman with kind eyes and a laugh that could light up any room. They had married in the spring of 1989, and 7 years later, Brooke was born. Harold used to joke that he was the luckiest man alive. He had meaningful work, a beautiful wife, and a daughter who looked at him like he could solve any problem in the world. Then, on a rainy Tuesday in October, everything changed. Catherine was driving home from the grocery store. A truck ran a red light. The doctor said she died on impact, that she felt no pain. Harold never knew if that was true, or just something they told widowers to help them sleep at night. What he did know was that he came home that day to an empty house and a 7-year-old daughter who kept asking when Mommy was coming back. The grief hit him like a physical force. For weeks, he could barely function. He would sit in Catherine's favorite chair for hours, holding her reading glasses, trying to remember the exact shade of her eyes. The courthouse became unbearable. Every hallway reminded him of her. Every corner held a ghost. He had met her there, proposed to her in the small garden behind the building, spent countless lunch breaks watching her work through the window. How could he walk those halls without her? His colleagues encouraged him to take time off, to heal, to return when he was ready. But Harold knew he would never be ready. Some wounds do not heal. They simply become part of you, a permanent ache that you learn to carry. So he made a choice that surprised everyone, including himself. He closed his practice, packed up his office, and stepped away from the law. Some people called it a breakdown. Others called it a waste. Harold called it survival. Little Brooke needed a father who was present, not a shell of a man lost in his own sorrow. So he found a new path. Landscaping had always been a hobby, something he and Catherine did together on weekends, planting flowers and trimming hedges. Now it became his livelihood. The work was physical, exhausting, and wonderfully mindless. He could lose himself in the rhythm of digging and planting, feel the sun on his back and the soil between his fingers, and for a few hours forget the weight of everything he had lost. He raised Brooke alone. There were no grandparents nearby, no siblings to help. It was just the two of them, figuring out how to be a family of two when they had always been three. Harold learned to braid hair by watching online tutorials at the library. He mastered pancakes shaped like bears and attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every soccer game. He was not perfect. There were nights when he sat on the porch after Brooke fell asleep, drinking coffee and talking to Catherine's memory, asking her if he was doing this right. But he kept going. That was all he knew how to do. People in town saw him as the quiet gardener, the widower who kept to himself. They did not know about the legal brief still stored in his attic, the bar membership he quietly renewed every year, the cases he followed in the news with a professional eye. They did not know that on Wednesday evenings, Harold volunteered at the community center, offering free legal advice to people who could not afford attorneys. He never stepped into a courtroom again, but the law never fully left him. It was like a language learned in childhood, dormant but never forgotten. He kept this part of himself separate from Brooke. She grew up knowing him as her father, the man who grew roses and made terrible jokes and always smelled like fresh-cut grass. He wanted her to have a normal childhood, unburdened by his past sorrows. So he never spoke much about his legal career, and when she asked about Mommy, he told her stories that made Catherine sound like a fairy tale princess, beautiful, kind, and watching over them from the stars. Brooke became his whole world. He drove her to college 4 hours away, helped her move into her dorm, and cried in the parking lot after she disappeared into the building. He walked her down the aisle when she married Preston, despite his private reservations about the groom's cold handshake and calculating eyes. He held his tongue when she stopped visiting as often, when her phone calls became shorter and more distant, when the light in her voice slowly dimmed. He told himself that she was an adult now, that she had to make her own choices, that his job was to love her, not to control her. But a father always knows when his child is suffering. Even from 4 hours away, Harold could hear the cracks in Brooke's voice. He could read between the lines of her too cheerful updates. He sensed the truth she was trying to hide, that her marriage was not the fairy tale she had hoped for, that the man she married was slowly crushing the person she used to be. Harold waited. He prayed. He hoped she would find the strength to save herself before it was too late. When Martha Chen called him that October morning, Harold was in his backyard, pruning his late-season roses. He listened without interrupting as the old woman explained everything: the divorce, the custody battle, the hearing scheduled for today. His daughter, fighting alone against a man with unlimited resources and no conscience. His daughter, too proud to ask for help, too ashamed to admit she was drowning. Harold thanked Martha and hung up the phone. He stood very still for a long moment, looking at the rose bush Catherine had planted 30 years ago. The branches were thick and strong now, survivors of countless winters. He thought about his wife, about the promises they had made when Brooke was born, to protect her, to always be there, to never let her face the darkness alone. He went inside and opened the closet in the spare bedroom. Behind boxes of Christmas decorations and old photo albums, there was a garment bag he had not touched in 25 years. The suit inside was outdated, but well-preserved, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes. Catherine had helped him pick it out for a big trial back in '93. He had worn it the day he won his first major case, and again when he argued before the State Court of Appeals. It smelled faintly of cedar and memories. Harold showered, shaved, and dressed with care. He retrieved his briefcase from the attic, still containing yellow legal pads and his favorite pen. His bar card was in his wallet, renewed just 2 months ago like every year, a connection to his past that he had never been able to sever. He paused at the front door and looked back at his modest home, at the garden that had been his refuge for a quarter century. Then he got in his truck and started driving. He found parking just as the afternoon session was resuming. He straightened his tie in the rearview mirror and noticed the tremor in his hands. Not fear. Anticipation. The same feeling he used to get before every big case. The electric awareness that everything depended on the next few hours. He picked up his briefcase and walked toward the building. The courthouse steps seemed steeper than he remembered, but he climbed them anyway, one at a time, carrying 25 years of silence toward a single wooden door. Inside Courtroom 7, the afternoon session had begun with Merrick calling his first witness. Preston sat at the petitioner's table, radiating confidence. His legal team had prepared for every contingency, anticipated every possible argument. What they had not prepared for was the impossible. Meaningful opposition from a woman with no resources and no representation. Brooke listened as a financial expert testified about stable home environments and the correlation between economic status and child welfare. The words washed over her like waves, each one pushing her further out to sea. She had prepared questions for cross-examination, scribbled on index cards, but they seemed laughably inadequate now. How could she compete with charts and graphs and expert credentials? When it was her turn to question the witness, she stood on unsteady legs. "Mr. Patterson, isn't it true that a parent's love and involvement matter more than their income level?" Her voice wavered. The expert gave her a pitying smile and launched into a condescending explanation of developmental psychology that made her question sound naive. Preston leaned back in his chair, enjoying the show. He caught her eye and mouthed 2 words. "Give up!" The casual cruelty of it hit her like a slap. This was not just about winning for him. It was about breaking her, about proving that she was nothing without him, that she never should have dared to leave. He leaned toward Merrick, his whisper loud enough to carry across the aisle. "She's just like her father. Nothing but dirty hands." The words sliced through Brooke like a blade. Her father, who had raised her alone. Her father, who had worked in the sun so she could have shade. Dirty hands, as if calluses were something to be ashamed of. The courtroom doors opened. Brooke did not turn around. She was too focused on fighting back tears, on holding herself together for just a few more hours. But she saw Preston's expression change. The smugness flickered, replaced by something else. Confusion, then recognition, then amusement. Well, Preston murmured to Merrick. The gardener came to watch. Brooke turned. And there, walking down the center aisle with quiet purpose, was her father. He looked different somehow. Older, yes, but also more solid, more certain. His suit was dated but pressed. His silver hair was neatly combed. And his eyes, those gentle eyes that had read her bedtime stories and wiped her tears, now held something she had never seen before. Steel. Harold Jennings approached the bar and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. My name is Harold Jennings. I am an attorney licensed to practice in this state, and I am requesting permission to enter an appearance on behalf of the respondent, Brooke Whitmore." The words did not make sense. Brooke stared at her father, her mouth slightly open. Attorney? Her father was a gardener. He had always been a gardener. He grew roses and mowed lawns and had dirt under his fingernails. He could not be a lawyer. That was impossible. Judge Coleman peered at him over her glasses. Mr. Jennings, do you have your credentials? Harold reached into his briefcase and produced his bar card, along with a certificate of good standing he had printed at the library that morning. He handed them to the bailiff, who examined them and passed them to the judge. She studied the documents for a long moment, then looked at Harold with new interest. These appear to be in order. Mr. Merrick, do you have any objection to Mr. Jennings entering an appearance at this stage? Merrick was already on his feet, his smooth composure showing the first crack. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The respondent has had ample time to secure representation. Introducing new counsel in the middle of proceedings could be seen as a delay tactic. I assure the court that I am not here to delay, Harold said. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who had stood in courtrooms 100 times. I am here because my daughter needs an advocate, and I am qualified to provide one. I have reviewed the case documents and am prepared to proceed immediately. Preston snorted. Your Honor, this man is a landscaper. I've seen him on his hands and knees pulling weeds. Whatever credentials he may have had, they're decades old. He's not equipped to handle a case of this complexity. Harold turned to look at Preston for the first time. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted. He seemed to grow taller, more formidable. Mr. Whitmore, he said quietly, the law does not require attorneys to have manicured hands, only manicured arguments. I suggest we let the court decide whose are sharper. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Coleman suppressed what might have been a smile. Mr. Jennings, your credentials are valid. You may enter an appearance on behalf of your daughter. Please take a seat at respondent's table. Harold walked past Preston without another glance. He sat down beside Brooke and placed his hand briefly over hers. His palm was warm and rough, the hand of a man who had spent decades working in the sun. But when he opened his briefcase and pulled out a yellow legal pad covered in handwritten notes, Brooke saw something else. Focus, preparation, the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Dad, she whispered, I don't understand. You never told me. You never said anything about being a lawyer. He squeezed her hand once before letting go. Some things, he said softly, we keep hidden until they're needed. Merrick was conferring urgently with Preston. The smug certainty had drained from both their faces. They had prepared for a one-sided fight. They had not prepared for Harold Jennings. Judge Coleman called the court back to order. Mr. Jennings, since you have just entered the case, would you like a brief recess to consult with your client? Harold rose smoothly. That won't be necessary, Your Honor. I have been preparing for this case for 7 years. I simply didn't know it until today. The cross-examination of the financial expert began again. But this time, it was different. Harold approached the witness stand with his legal pad, his questions precise and deliberate. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Each question built on the last, constructing an argument piece by piece. Mr. Patterson, you testified that financial stability is a primary indicator of suitable custody arrangements. Is that correct? Yes, generally speaking. And you based your assessment of Mrs. Whitmore's financial situation on documents provided by the petitioner's counsel. That's correct. Harold nodded slowly. Did those documents include any information about why Mrs. Whitmore's financial situation changed so dramatically 3 months ago? Patterson shifted in his seat. I'm not sure what you mean. Let me be more specific. Did anyone inform you that Mr. Whitmore froze all joint accounts and canceled all credit cards in his wife's name within 24 hours of being served with divorce papers? Merrick jumped up. Objection. This is not relevant to the witness's expertise. Harold turned to the judge. Your Honor, the witness has been presented as an expert on the relationship between financial stability and parenting capability. If his analysis is based on incomplete information, the court should know. Judge Coleman nodded. Overruled. The witness may answer. Patterson looked uncomfortable. I was not informed of those specific circumstances. No. So your expert opinion, Harold continued, is based on a snapshot of my daughter's finances that was deliberately engineered by her husband to make her look unstable. Would that be accurate? I can only analyze the data I'm given. Indeed. Harold paused, letting the implication settle over the courtroom. No further questions for this witness. The afternoon wore on, and with each passing hour, the momentum shifted. Harold requested permission to introduce evidence of his own, documents that Brooke did not know he possessed. Bank statements showing unusual transfers from Preston's accounts to offshore holdings. Emails between Preston and his colleagues discussing his strategy to destroy his wife in court. Text messages in which Preston admitted that he did not actually want custody of Penny, only wanted to use the threat of it as leverage. Merrick objected repeatedly. Some objections were sustained, others overruled. But the damage was being done, question by question, document by document. The narrative Preston had so carefully constructed was developing cracks. The pivotal moment came when Harold called Preston to the stand. It was a risk. Cross-examining the opposing party could backfire spectacularly. But Harold had watched his son-in-law for years, had seen the arrogance behind the charm, the cruelty beneath the polish. He knew exactly where to press. Mr. Whitmore, you have testified that you are seeking primary custody of your daughter because you believe you can provide a more stable environment. Is that correct? Preston sat in the witness chair with forced casualness. That's right. And how many hours per week would you estimate you spend with Penny? I work long hours, but I make time for my daughter whenever I can. Can you give me a specific number? 5 hours. 10? Preston's jaw tightened. It varies. In the past year, how many of Penny's school events have you attended? I've attended several. Harold pulled a document from his folder. I have here a list of school events provided by Millbrook Elementary. There were 14 events this past year. Parent-teacher conferences, holiday performances, field day, art shows. According to school records, you attended 0 of these events. Your wife, on the other hand, attended all 14. I was working. Someone has to pay the bills. Indeed. And when Penny had her tonsils removed last spring, who stayed with her at the hospital? That's not relevant. Your Honor, I believe it speaks directly to the question of parental involvement. Judge Coleman nodded. Answer the question, Mr. Whitmore. Preston's voice was tight. My wife stayed with her. And when Penny had nightmares, who comforted her? When she learned to ride a bicycle, who taught her? When she cried on her first day of school, who dried her tears? Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness. Your Honor, these are simple questions about parental involvement. The very issue Mr. Whitmore claims qualifies him for primary custody. The judge considered for a moment. I'll allow it. Mr. Whitmore, please answer. Preston's mask was slipping. The charming facade was cracking to reveal something uglier underneath. My wife handled most of the day-to-day parenting. That's what she chose to do. Because you provided financial support. Exactly. The same financial support you withdrew completely the moment she asked for a divorce. Silence. Preston's face had gone red. Harold picked up another document. I have here a text message you sent to your colleague, James Hartley, 3 days after your wife filed for divorce. Would you like me to read it aloud? Merrick was on his feet. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The authenticity of these documents has not been established. I'm happy to call Mr. Hartley as a witness to verify the messages, Harold said calmly. He's waiting in the hall. The bluff landed. Preston's face drained of color. He had not known about the messages, had not imagined that his casual cruelty, typed late at night when he thought no one was watching, could come back to haunt him. Judge Coleman leaned forward. Mr. Jennings, what do these messages contain? Your Honor, in this message, Mr. Whitmore writes, and I quote, I don't actually want the kid, but taking her away is the only thing that will really hurt Brooke. She needs to learn what happens when she tries to leave me. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Brooke stared at her husband, the man she had loved, the man she had married believing he would protect her. The ugliness of his words hung in the air like a physical thing. Preston's composure shattered. That's out of context. I was angry. I didn't mean it. Which part didn't you mean, Mr. Whitmore? That you don't actually want custody of your daughter? Or that your primary motivation is causing pain to your wife? I want what's best for Penny. Do you? Because according to your own words, what you want is revenge. Judge Coleman raised her hand. That's enough. I've heard sufficient testimony on this matter. She looked at Preston with an expression that had moved far past neutral. We will take a 30-minute recess while I review the evidence presented. Court is adjourned until 4 o'clock. The gavel fell. Preston sat frozen in the witness chair as Merrick rushed to his side, hissing urgent words. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations, but Harold simply gathered his papers, placed them neatly in his briefcase, and turned to his daughter. Brooke was crying. Not the desperate tears of the morning, but something else. Relief. Gratitude. Wonder. She had watched her father transform before her eyes, from the gentle gardener she had always known into something far more formidable. And she finally understood why he had never told her. They found a bench in the hallway, away from the crowd. Harold sat beside his daughter, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, catching dust motes in the air. Somewhere down the corridor, a water fountain hummed. Brooke finally found her voice. Why didn't you ever tell me? Harold looked at his hands, at the calluses and weathered skin that told the story of his past 25 years. Because I wanted to give you a normal childhood. After your mother died, I couldn't stay in the courtroom. Every corner of that building reminded me of her. We met there, you know. She was working at the clerk's office, and I was a young lawyer with too much confidence and not enough sense. He smiled at the memory, a bittersweet curve of his lips. I proposed to her in the garden behind the old courthouse. She said yes before I even finished asking. And after she was gone, I couldn't walk those halls without seeing her everywhere. So I walked away. But you kept your license. I did. Harold nodded slowly. Every year I renewed it. I told myself it was just habit. But I think I always knew there might come a day when I needed it again. When you needed it. Brooke shook her head in disbelief. All those years. You were helping people at the community center, weren't you? The free legal clinic Martha mentioned once. Nothing formal. Just advice for folks who couldn't afford attorneys. Tenants being evicted, workers being cheated. Small things. He paused. I never took a case to court. I couldn't. But I could still help in my own way. And today? Harold turned to look at his daughter, and his eyes glistened. Today, I walked into a courtroom for the first time since your mother died. For you. Because no one, not even the ghost of my grief, is going to stop me from protecting my child. Brooke leaned her head on her father's shoulder, the way she used to do when she was small. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. About the divorce, about all of it. I was ashamed. Ashamed of what? Of leaving a man who didn't deserve you? Of failing. You raised me to be strong, and I let myself become someone who was afraid of her own husband. Harold put his arm around her. Honey, strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up. You filed for divorce. You walked away from a man who was trying to break you. You came to this courtroom alone, prepared to fight for your daughter, with nothing but your own courage. That's not failure. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Court clerks walked past, attorneys in crisp suits, families waiting for their own hearings, the ordinary machinery of justice, grinding forward one case at a time. Dad, Brooke said quietly, what Mom would think of all this. Harold's voice was soft. I think she would be proud of both of us. A court officer appeared at the end of the hallway. The judge is ready to resume. Harold stood and offered his daughter his hand. Shall we? They walked back into the courtroom together. The atmosphere had shifted. Preston sat at his table looking diminished, his expensive suit suddenly seeming like a costume. Merrick's confidence had evaporated, replaced by the careful neutrality of a lawyer who knows his case is collapsing. In the gallery, several more observers had appeared, drawn by courthouse gossip about the unexpected turn of events. Word had spread about the gardener, who was actually a lawyer, about the text messages, about the father who had come out of retirement to save his daughter. Judge Coleman took her seat and surveyed the room. Having reviewed the evidence and testimony presented today, I am prepared to issue a preliminary ruling. She removed her glasses and looked directly at Preston. Mr. Whitmore, I have rarely seen such a clear case of litigation being used as a weapon. The evidence suggests that you have deliberately manipulated financial circumstances to disadvantage your wife, and that your pursuit of custody is motivated not by concern for your child, but by a desire to cause harm to her mother. Preston's attorney stood. Your Honor, my client contests these characterizations. Mr. Merrick, your client's own words, presented in verified text messages, speak for themselves. I am not in the habit of second-guessing confessions. The judge turned to Brooke. Mrs. Whitmore, the court acknowledges that you have been the primary caregiver for your daughter throughout her life. The financial difficulties you currently face are directly attributable to your husband's actions following your divorce filing. These circumstances do not reflect poorly on your parenting ability. She shuffled her papers. It is the preliminary ruling of this court that primary custody of Penelope Whitmore shall be awarded to the respondent, Brooke Whitmore. The petitioner shall be granted standard visitation rights, subject to review. Furthermore, the petitioner is ordered to unfreeze all joint accounts and provide appropriate spousal support pending the final divorce settlement. Brooke's hand found her father's under the table and squeezed. The words washed over her like warm rain after a long drought. Judge Coleman continued, Mr. Whitmore, I strongly advise you to reflect on your conduct in these proceedings. The court does not look favorably on parties who use children as pawns in their personal conflicts. A final hearing will be scheduled to address the remaining matters of property division and permanent custody arrangements. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell one final time. Preston sat motionless for a long moment, staring at the table in front of him. Merrick gathered his files with quick, efficient movements, already mentally composing the appeal he knew his client would demand. But Preston did not move. Something had shifted behind his eyes, some wall cracking that had stood firm for years. Finally, he stood. Merrick leaned in to whisper something, but Preston shook his head. He walked toward the door, then paused. For a heartbeat, he stood there, his back to the room. Then he turned, just slightly, and looked at Harold. No words passed between them, but Preston gave a single, small nod. Not an apology, not even an admission of wrong, but an acknowledgement, a recognition that he had underestimated the man with the calloused hands, that the gardener had beaten him at his own game. Then Preston walked out, Merrick hurrying after him, and the door swung shut behind them. The gallery emptied slowly, people casting curious glances at the father and daughter, still seated at the respondents' table. A court clerk approached and offered Harold a quiet nod of recognition. "Mr. Jennings, that was impressive work. I haven't seen cross-examination like that in years." Harold smiled modestly. "It's like riding a bicycle. You never quite forget." They gathered their things and walked out of the courtroom together. In the lobby, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting golden rectangles on the marble floor. Brooke stopped and turned to her father. "How can I ever thank you? You can let me meet my granddaughter properly. I've missed too many years already." Brooke laughed, a sound that felt foreign after so many months of tears. "She's going to love you. She already does. She asks about Grandpa Harold all the time." They walked out through the courthouse doors into an October afternoon that had somehow transformed from gray to gold. At the bottom of the steps, a small figure was waiting, bouncing impatiently beside a familiar minivan. Martha Chen had driven 4 hours with precious cargo. Penny saw her mother and grandfather and broke into a run. She launched herself at Brooke first, small arms wrapping tight around her waist. "Mommy, Mommy, I missed you." Brooke knelt down and held her daughter close, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. "I missed you too, sweetheart. So much." Then Penny noticed the silver-haired man standing beside them. She looked up with curious eyes. "Grandpa Harold?" Harold crouched down to her level, his old knees protesting the motion. He studied his granddaughter's face, seeing echoes of Catherine in the shape of her nose, traces of Brooke in her determined chin. "Hello, Penny. I'm sorry I haven't visited more often. Your grandpa has been very busy growing roses. Mommy says you have the prettiest garden in the whole world." "Well, I don't know about that, but I'd like to show it to you sometime. Would you like that?" Penny nodded enthusiastically. Then her expression turned serious, the way only a 7-year-old's can when they sense something important has happened. "Grandpa, did you help Mommy today?" Harold's throat tightened. He reached out and gently cupped her small face in his weathered hands. "I made a promise a long time ago, sweetheart. When your mommy was just a little girl like you, I promised I would always protect her." He smiled, his eyes glistening. "Today, I kept that promise." Penny wrapped her arms around his neck, squeezing tight. "You're the best grandpa in the whole world." Harold held her close, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and innocence. Over her shoulder, he saw Brooke wiping tears from her cheeks. Some promises, he thought, are worth waiting 25 years to keep. When Penny finally pulled back, she reached out and touched his hand, tracing the rough calluses with her small fingers. "Your hands are scratchy." Harold smiled. "That's because they've done a lot of work over the years." "What kind of work?" He glanced up at Brooke, who nodded slightly. "All kinds," Harold said. "Planting flowers, pulling weeds, and sometimes, when someone I love needs help, these old hands remember how to fight." Penny considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old philosopher. "Like a superhero?" Harold laughed, a sound rusty from disuse, but genuine. "Something like that." He straightened up and took his granddaughter's hand in his weathered one. On his other side, Brooke slipped her arm through his. 3 generations, standing together in the autumn sunshine. Martha Chen watched from beside her minivan, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. In the courthouse behind them, the ordinary business of justice continued. But here, on these steps, a different kind of justice had been served. The kind that could not be quantified in legal briefs or court rulings. The kind that was measured in embraces and second chances, and the unbreakable bonds between parent and child. Harold looked at the courthouse one last time. Somewhere inside those walls, Catherine's memory still lingered. He could almost see her now, young and smiling, walking toward him across the lobby with that light in her eyes. She would have loved this moment. She would have been so proud. "Dad," Brooke's voice was gentle. "Are you okay?" Harold nodded slowly. "I was just thinking about your mother, how she always said that love was the only thing strong enough to bring us back from the dead." He squeezed both their hands. "I think I finally understand what she meant." They walked down the steps together, three figures silhouetted against the golden light. Behind them, the courthouse stood solid and impassive, keeper of countless stories of conflict and resolution. But this particular story was finished. The gardener had laid down his tools, picked up his briefcase, and remembered who he used to be. And in doing so, he had given his daughter and granddaughter a future. Some battles are won with money and power. Others are won with preparation and skill. But the most important battles, Harold knew, are won with love. The kind of love that waits patiently for 25 years, that watches from a distance while hoping for the best, that finally steps forward when silence is no longer an option. As they reached the parking lot, Penny tugged on Harold's hand. "Grandpa, will you come visit us now?" Harold smiled down at his granddaughter, at this small person who held so much of his heart. "I'll do better than that, sweetheart. I'm going to be around so much you'll get tired of me." "I could never get tired of you," Penny said with absolute certainty. Harold felt something crack open in his chest, a wall he had built so carefully over 25 years. Behind it was a reservoir of love he had kept dammed up, afraid to let it flow, afraid that if he loved too much again, he would lose too much again. But now, looking at his daughter and granddaughter in the golden afternoon light, he understood that the fear had been wrong. Love was not diminished by sharing it. Love grew stronger when you let it out. He thought of Catherine, of her gentle hands and warm smile, of all the years they should have had together. She would have adored Penny. She would have moved heaven and earth to be part of her granddaughter's life. And maybe, in some small way, she had. Maybe she had been guiding him all along, keeping his license active, keeping his skills sharp, preparing him for this moment when his family would need him most. "Thank you," he whispered to the sky, to the woman who still lived in his heart after all these years. "Thank you for giving me the courage to come back." The three of them got into Harold's old pickup truck, Penny buckled safely between them. As Harold started the engine, Brooke reached over and placed her hand on his arm. "I love you, Dad." 3 words, simple and profound. Words he had waited 7 years to hear, without the shadow of Preston's influence, without the distance that marriage had created between them. Words that meant his daughter had come home. "I love you too, honey. More than you'll ever know." He pulled out of the parking lot and turned toward the highway. 4 hours of driving lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Harold did not mind. He had his daughter beside him, his granddaughter chattering excitedly about the roses she wanted to see, and a future that suddenly seemed full of possibility. In the rearview mirror, the courthouse grew smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared from view. Harold kept his eyes on the road ahead, on the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, on the promise of tomorrow. The gardener was going home, but he was carrying something more precious than any flower he had ever grown. He was carrying his family, and this time, he was never letting go.